Well, let's get started here, folks. I want to thank you guys for coming out and thank the school district, Scott, and everybody for participating with us. And I think what the intent is, those who couldn't make it here, we're going to get this filmed and get it out on both the website and maybe the emails to the parents. So, this is something that is going to reach the entire district. And I want to really thank Tom for coming out from DPI. I've known him for a while. Great staffer. Used to be for one of my colleagues in the assembly. Now he's moved on to DPI. And what I found helpful is a legislator, I got this presentation with my colleagues and really hit home, being a father of 4 young children, some of the impacts we're going to have in the budget and what's been going on historically the last few years and what's going to go on in the future if we continue on this path. And for a great district like McFarland, I think there's going to be some things that we need to talk about and be concerned about. So without further ado, I'm going to have Tom come up here and he's going to lead us through this presentation, and I'm sure he'll take some questions if we have some of those afterwards. So Tom, thank you.
Thank you, Representative. As Representative Call mentioned, my name is Tom McCarthy. I am the Communications Officer at the Department of Public Instruction. We do this presentation around the state mostly to explain how some of the changing impacts of school demographics have affected schools. Everyone has a little bit different of an impact, so we kind of tailor this to the community and to the listeners. If there are things that you think I go too fast on, feel free to stop me, ask questions. This is available on our website after for you to review if something really caught your eye. One of the things before I start, there is a lot of information in here. So what we kind of encourage people to do is pay attention to things that really latch on in your mind and try to get the in-depth information that we're trying to present to you from that particular slide or piece of the presentation. So I'm going to start out here. This is a moving infographic showing poverty in the state of Wisconsin. What you're going to notice is that over the course of the 11 years that this particular graphic shows, poverty has both increased throughout the state, but it is also extremely localized in its impact. So there are certain districts around the state that have seen a tremendous amount of growth. You'll notice some of the areas in central and northern Wisconsin, southwestern Wisconsin, northeastern Wisconsin. So it's also happening in areas that traditionally had lower impact from poverty in their schools. That couples with how many students are in actual districts around the state. So what we're seeing is that on the statewide level, enrollment in public schools has remained rather flat over the past 15 years, but between districts, it's changed rapidly. So the green on this graphic shows districts that are increasing enrollment, the reds show districts that are decreasing enrollment. What else to take away from this? What it means to be rural in the state of Wisconsin and how many districts are losing over the past 11 years has changed dramatically to the point in which we have over 55% of our districts with under 1,000 kids in their districts. Coupled together, you're going to see the big takeaway here, which is that as districts lose students, they also are gaining poverty. The big, heavy red areas that I mentioned before, as districts are gaining, they're also gaining poverty. So this has kind of a doubling up effect for school districts. As you're losing kids, you're dealing with kids that are more impoverished. The districts that are gaining kids are dealing with more impoverished students as well. So it affects districts differently, but it is something that we're seeing in a statewide picture that is changing the shape of schools, something that the legislature and our funding system has not fully caught up with. What else do we know about poverty? What we know about poverty is that as you increase poverty, you're more likely to have what we consider a low-performing school. When you have extreme areas of either lots of poverty or little poverty, we tend to be able to take a pretty strong correlation away from you and rank you. So we're able to tell, based solely on how many impoverished kids you have, how you're going to do on our accountability system. This graphic, each little dot represents a school district that falls into one of our 5 buckets. Poverty is not the only thing that we notice and can take away from school districts, though, based on their demographics. This black line running across here. Easiest way to explain this to you guys is students who are white and who are poor, economically disadvantaged students. These other lines represent different subgroups that we measure. So poverty is an important piece, but we also know that students who fit into one of our students of color categories that we actually can disaggregate for, you'll notice here, American Indian Black, they actually perform lower than our white students who are economically disadvantaged. So as demographics change in our schools, these are the kinds of things that are important for everybody to know, and that by and large, the people of Wisconsin are not fully caught up with. Students of color also are more likely to attend one of the low-performing schools. So knowing what you know about poverty, knowing what I just explained to you about students of color, this graphic over here on the far left, districts which fall into one of our lowest buckets, the fails to meet category, house most of the students who are of the breakouts that we can disaggregate for. We're going to talk a little bit now about school governance issues, probably one of the more controversial topics, something that you guys may have questions about or want more information about. But what I really want to hammer home for you guys here is that the majority of students in Wisconsin attend a traditional public school. Okay? So 829,000 students attend a public school in the state of Wisconsin. A small amount, which you see over on this left, or on the right, excuse me, over here, get the vast majority of the attention of the legislature and the public. Voucher programs started small, as this graphic says, but as time has gone on, the number of students who are attending on a voucher has increased dramatically. What else do we know about students that are actually attending those schools? So this is an interesting graphic here which shows that of the schools that participate in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, 79% of the students in those schools are actually attending that school on a voucher, okay? So they're receiving a subsidy from the government to go to a private school. In the Racine Parental Choice Program, they're at 44%. That number is increasing exponentially. In the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, they're at 4%. Remember, that program just started 2 years ago. So we're seeing growth in that again this year. This has not been updated with our most recent information. I think this figure right here is around 9 or 10%. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but what that does is it says that of the students who are attending a voucher, going to a voucher school, 64% of them are on that voucher. So you take a private school in the state of Wisconsin that participates in the voucher program, aggregate them all together, the Milwaukee program, the longest running, the Racine program, the second longest running, the Wisconsin program, the newest one, 64% of those students in those schools that participate are on a voucher. Public subsidized. One of the other things that you hear people talking about, voucher advocates, is that they would like to see a voucher in every student's backpack. What you don't hear them talk about is what the actual cost of doing that would be to the state of Wisconsin. So I told you about those 829,000 kids that attend a public school. We also know that there are 93,000 kids in the state of Wisconsin that are private pay students, meaning their parents elect to send them to a private school, they bear the full brunt of that cost. If they were to jump into the voucher program with an increased voucher payment of $10,000, which is about, on average, how much each school district in the state spends on a kid, that would amount to $930 million, which is unaccounted for right now. So it's a new additional expenditure of $930 million per year for those private pay kids to come onto the system. Students that are already in the voucher, K-8 and K-9-12, breakdown, which have different voucher amounts now, bringing them up to that $10,000 amount, the average expenditure of a public school in the state, would cost an additional $77 million. Total yearly cost of bringing a voucher in every backpack to the state of Wisconsin is $1 billion, using that figure, okay? So if there's anything on here that doesn't make sense to you, let me know now, because this is an important takeaway. Yes?
Sure. I'm Scott Brown, the school superintendent, and former business manager, so that's kind of why I just want to point this out, because it's really of interest to me. But when you see the ad, I used to be a private school principal. That's what I did for 7 years before I came to McFarland to be business manager. And I used to think that, you know, sort of the how do we do things for so much less in a private school versus a public school. And I actually got to a public school. So when you see $10,000 per student, you say that's the state average cost. What you don't see in a district like McFarland, which is probably even less than like a city school district like Madison, is in McFarland we probably have 3 students that we spend $100,000 on, and probably another 10 that we spend $50,000 on. So if you gave the average voucher school, if those students drove up and wanted to come, the students who are perhaps catatonic, are fed through tubes, are diapered, are changed, have seizures, no private school is going to accept them for $10,000 a student. And I think what I kind of lost in the process that I learned coming to a public school was that every student, there is no skilled care facility for students. There's no nursing home, or maybe like other people, like some people my age grew up, that's where students went. Every student no matter what their disability, no matter how severe, is in a public school. And that's state law, that's federal law, and that's what we do. So whenever I see, you know, that number of 10,000, I always get concerned that people think, oh my gosh, they spend 10,000 per student. I would guess that McFarland, you know, an elementary student, we might be between 6 and 7, and a high school student between, you know, 8 and 9.
Mm-hmm.
When you subtract out the extremely high need students that sometimes we actually have to send away, fully boarded by an institution because we can't handle them within our own walls.
That's a good point. It actually brings up two things. First of all, the demographic piece at the beginning of this. The students that we were showing you that were more impoverished, we know that they do cost more to educate because they tend to be behind their peers at grade level, which was some of the other achievement attainment information that we went through already on the loopy graph of low-performing schools with high-performing schools and how they correlate with how many students are impoverished there. That encompasses them in this calculation as well. It encompasses students with disabilities, as the superintendent pointed out. It encompassed any other kid who the school district, the public school district, is required to educate, okay? So that number, as Scott aptly pointed out, can be distorted slightly, but it's used as a figure by which private schools peg their ask for the voucher amount. So this amount right here is the state law set amount that we pay to private school kids who attend on a voucher. So that you can see that over time, this number didn't used to be 7856. In fact, for a long time, it was 6,442, regardless of what level of school you went to. Before that, it was less, before that, it was less, and before that, it was even less. So over time, that number has increased, and the increased goal is to peg it to that $10,000 figure, which again, represents all students and not the students that these particular schools are educating.
What happens if a student goes into the voucher school and then doesn't work up to what they anticipate is a acceptable level? Do they give special help for those kids? Do they have special assistance for kids that can't perform well in schools, or what do they do for that?
That's a good question. They do tend to, on the overall, on the whole, they do provide a lot of similar services to public schools. The difference between that and the reason why the superintendent was highlighting this for you guys is that if they choose to kick that kid out for whatever reason, performance, behavior, inability to educate them up to the snuff that the school wants to educate their students to, they come back to the public school system. The public school system is the system of last resort. So if nobody else will take that particular kid for whatever reason, the public schools are required to take them and educate them.
What happens to the money that went to that voucher school? Does that stay at the voucher school? Continue to be paid?
It depends on the circumstances, but in most cases it's prorated. So if you went for half the school year, we'd give them half the voucher amount. What doesn't get shown there, though, is when they move back into the public school.
Yeah.
They're not only a year behind in paying for that kid because they've been gone. We pay public schools on the year prior, we pay voucher schools in the year of. So they're going back to that public school, asking them to be served by that public school in the year of, and the school district has not counted them. So there is a lag in between when you transfer systems. And that's
funding difference.
It's true. And that's true for any student that moves from a public school to a public school or comes to a public school when they weren't otherwise educated there. But it is an important thing to note in these particular programs because in a city like Milwaukee, there's a high transferability of students. So you have students that'll jump from the voucher program to a public school, to a charter school, back to a public school within one school year. And that has a tremendous impact on the needs of a classroom. If you're a public school student who sat in that classroom all year long, your amount of funding and how they allocate a teacher or an aide to that classroom can be changed based on that student that jumps in and out.
How much oversight do you have over the voucher schools as far as curriculum, as far as performance of the kids? Does DPI have any oversight ability over those schools?
I would say that by and large it's a reporting oversight. It's not an oversight of the activity that takes place in the classroom. So we require hours of
So you really have none?
or reporting oversight and not actual classroom oversight like you would consider in a public school system.
Sure.
So
So they report what they want to report, any way they want to report it, and
there are statutorily required things that they are to report. They have to provide us with audited information. They have to adopt curriculum. They do things that by and large look like public schools, but I think the point that you're hammering home on is the accountability piece.
right?
A public school is accountable to the people that elect their school board and the people that hire their teachers and hire their superintendent.
Right.
A private school is a different monster. It does its own sort of accountability by choosing their teachers, choosing whether or not to enter the voucher program, which comes with a different set of parameters.
Sure.
They're different animals. And when we get into situations like this where they're mashed together, the comparisons are very difficult.
So what's the driving force to get that fund up to the $10,000? How's that being done? Through legislative?
Absolutely, through the
So
state.
the legislature wants to do that. They want to get more money to them.
Mhm. So
What's the
last year,
advantage to that?
the advantage to it is that they would then be able to justify taking more students. So it's a encouraging and coaxing model of trying to
It's
get.
a money thing, is all it is.
That's another way to break it down.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep going ahead, but keep
Yeah.
any questions you've got here in the back of your mind because I'll happily
Sure.
work with you on them. So as we've been kind of highlighting here, that dual system and all of the demographic changes cause some school finance challenges that happen. So just backing up to the 300,000 foot level, how we fund our schools is based on some statutorily set principles and the amount of students that come in and out of a school district or school. Revenue limits, which are the amount that a school district can spend by law. State equalization aid, which is how much the state says we're going to help you cover those costs. When you balance those two out, what you have left on the right-hand side of the equation is how much you're asking your property taxpayers to pick up. All of that stuff in the red box there is governed by law, which means that no matter what you do, unless you pass a referendum, you're not going to be able to change those particular things. Student enrollment, the amounts of costs that you were spending essentially in 1993-94 have all been locked into the system that the legislature can attribute more money on this particular piece based on a per pupil amount. They can do lots of different things to change how much you can spend, but once they make those changes, that red box stays locked in by law. There are some other funds that happen outside of those revenue limits that districts can spend as they get them. Categorical aids, which are targeted to specific programs or helping specific students. Federal money, which comes obviously from the federal government. Other revenue, donations, and specific funds that are taken outside of that box that school districts can run. So now that I've told you that, this particular slide shows how much general aid as a percent has been spent on schools over time. What you're going to notice here, this black line is a trend line, thanks to Microsoft Excel, which shows that over time, the amount the state has spent for every tax dollar they bring in on schools has decreased. We went from a high water mark in 2003-04 where 43% of the money the state brought in they spent on public schools. Over the past few years, that number has continued to tick down to now, as the state collects $1, they spend 32 cents on public schools. It is still the single largest expenditure, but it's important when I show you this next graph, which is how much the state has spent overall in billions of dollars over time, has actually gone up. So those two pieces are in direct conflict with each other. The state is actually pulling in more revenue. They're spending less as a percentage on public schools. So it's a priority thing. Also, during the Great Recession, revenue limits were actually decreased for the first time in almost 100 years by 5.5% per student in the first year of the 11-13 budget, as you can see there. When it was brought back up for the future, that little red line there is the creation of something that was entirely new, which is a per pupil categorical aid. So when I showed you that box of statutorily set things, I told you about categorical aids in the bottom that are outside of limits. If a school district gets a categorical aid, they can spend it. If they don't get it, they can't spend it.
How do you get it?
It's based completely on how the legislature or the government decides that they want you to fund it. So in this case right here, it's based on how many students you have. You take how many students you have, you would times it by, and depending on the year, either $75, $150, or $50, and then you'd be able to expend that resource. As a reflection of that decrease during the Great Recession, not only were revenue limits cut, educators lost. Okay, so this shows you teachers, aides, administrators, and support staff that were lost during that time period of crunch. Okay, these are people that we have not quite yet made up in buying back, but I think the important takeaway for everybody is that these were people with actual experience, long tenured classroom time. On the overall, the people that are being hired back on the statewide picture, we've seen a slight decrease in the amount of years of experience that an educator has in the state of Wisconsin, which is important to students in classrooms because there are different ways of distributing educators to classrooms, and what we've also noticed in larger districts is that Younger teachers are being shifted to classrooms of greater need. So when you lose that experience, you have to make policy decisions about where you're putting your teachers and why you're putting your teachers. So, referenda.
It also had a lot to do with that 10 changes and the teachers getting out of the profession because of the changes that were happening to their.
I would say it was a doubling effect. You had districts that were being required to tighten their belts, and then you had policy changes that were being made to employees to somewhat encourage their retirement if they were at that age.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So how it's looking on the ground right now for McFarland, I mean, we've always been blessed with just like hundreds of teachers per opening. So we used to get about 300 per elementary opening. Other people wanted to come here, new teachers. This year in third grade, one of our openings has under 100, which then when you get to the high need areas, now you're really in bidding wars. And unless we get more teachers in the pipeline in those areas, it's going to be really hard to find special education teachers, school psychologists. Tech ed is decimated because a guy can go work first year at a car dealership, in the shop. So in McFarland, we created a hard to recruit, hard to retain, pot of money to try to keep people here, but it's really hard at some point to be able to keep up with districts that are growing fast and seem to have more funding. We've been about the same size for 20 years, so it's really a challenge. I think the long-term challenge is more that we just aren't seeing some of the students go into education that we were before, and we've lost I think 3 or 4 teachers now to Epic. Because these guys are talented. I mean, they can go do that.
Sure.
So if they don't feel the teachers kind of a calling. If they lose the calling and sort of the heart, and I want to make a difference, and in some way feel like that isn't valued anymore. It's really hard to keep the ones who really are sometimes the most talented.
I think that's true. It brings up a couple of points, and I'm glad that we're hovering on these slides now that you brought those up, is that we have seen a lot of anecdotal stories about school districts and teacher transferability. So the same thing that we were talking about with kids and the voucher program moving between schools. Districts that can and afford to recruit teachers. So they go after high-performing teachers, or they go after teachers in skilled fields, like the superintendent had mentioned, that there is a market for. And districts that are willing to spend and can spend because of their conditions are pulling them away from districts who either can't spend it because they don't have the property tax base, the wealth, or if they just generally don't have the support of their community to do those sorts of activities. So it's creating a system of haves and have-nots. This slide, though, obviously yesterday was election day. There were 74 different referenda questions asked of districts around the state. So this slide does not reflect that yet. Of those 74, 67% were passed. But what's unique and what I'd like to highlight with you guys is the type of referenda that districts are starting to go to. So historically, when people talk about a referendum in a district, your mind immediately jumps to buildings, right? Like, I want to build a computer lab, I want to build an auditorium. Historically speaking, over time, those types of questions have decreased significantly. So they went from a high water mark of around 112 questions per year, sometime in the early 2000s, to now they're down into, I think yesterday there were around 30 questions about issuing debt for buildings. What has increased more are these two categories, non-recurring and recurring. We call those cost to continue referenda, okay? So that means that this particular district wants to go outside of that first red box that I showed you in the funding formula to increase their costs on a non-recurring portion until the referenda is off. This could be 10 years, it could be 5 years, it could be 2 years even, but they are needing to violate the state law or change the state law to be able to pay for the regular opportunities that they provide to kids. The recurring portion down here is going forward forever. We want to spend X amount of dollars more to keep up with the cost of educating kids. Of those two categories yesterday, 77% that were both recurring or non-recurring passed. Recurring referenda, there were only 2 and both of them passed. So what you're starting to see in conjunction with that have and have not situation is that communities are starting to realize that if they want to keep their schools afloat, they're going to have to do it. They're going to have to shoulder some of the cost. And that's challenging given the fact that I presented information at the beginning of this showing that poverty is increasing in our schools and students are leaving certain districts. I think I saw a hand twitch out of you.
Yeah, are schools penalized for having a savings account, like having, like setting money back?
Schools don't really traditionally have savings accounts
But if
as
they
you
have,
think
like,
of
they
it.
put money back in their budget for next year, are they penalized going forward?
Not really. I guess let's unpackage that a little bit
Yeah.
now. You will hear some people talk about what fund balances are to school districts. You're sitting here with the superintendent in the room who is also a business official. We have a great resource, but what I'm going to tell you guys is that fund balances are a snapshot in time. Okay,
Right.
so we look at a fund balance report and say at this particular date you had this much money there. What we don't tell you is that over the course of a school year, we pay districts in installments, again, based on the prior year. So there are times of the year where they haven't been paid for 6 months to operate their schools. The legislature has also done over time, and this was actually a Jim Doyle accounting trick, delayed a payment to school districts past the fiscal year. So we pay school districts after the fiscal year because the state wants to keep resource allocation on that money. And that's a rather large payment that goes to those school districts. So a fund balance, as you think of it, is not really a savings account that the district can say, oh, we need new computers, let's access this money. It's more of a way by which that they can make do and also to leverage any kind of costs that they may need to borrow on to prove that they're solvent. So it's different than a savings account, and that's why I appreciate the question, but it's a good thing to have information. Yeah, it's a good thing to have information on because you will hear people say, why is there a crisis in schools? I hear that fund balances on the overall are increasing. That's because costs are increasing, right? So what that traditionally would have been your dollar that you had set aside before isn't worth a dollar anymore as inflation takes hold. So, do you have anything to add on that? I'd love to hear your perspective.
It's really hard as a business manager to, no matter what your situation is, to run a deficit because you want to be fiscally responsible. You want to try to come in as close as you can. So most districts add probably an inflationary amount to sort of where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
In McFarland, our fund balance has grown some. We're facing, we think, between a $500,000 and $900,000 deficit. Where that fund balance is going to come in, frankly, is a lot of districts right now, with the way the legislature is sort of debating school funding, will suddenly go in like cost-cutting mode, and it just creates all sorts of angst, distracts like your teachers from their kids. It creates this really kind of hard culture when you don't know what's going to happen because it still could change. So our approach will be that we'll recommend to the board that you use fund balance. That's part of why you have a savings account, is when the budget doesn't come in the way you expect. And then you spend the next year really very patiently talking about what are you going to do next, what are some of your choices. Gives you a chance to even go to the community and say, we want to increase class size, or we want to maybe have a vote on this, decide what to do.
Yep.
So I think fund balance, if you don't have that, if we didn't have that for us, we wouldn't have the luxury to say, we don't have to kind of respond to this, to whatever happens to come up within either budget scenario. This isn't a bipartisan comment on my part. There's been difficult budgets on both sides of the aisle that we've had to try to make adjustments, but at least in McFarland we've tried to just have the fund balance there so that we don't have to impact the taxpayers or our community with a lot of stress. And even with that fund balance that we have, I think we're up around 22% of our budget. Because of the cycle you talked about, we probably borrow between $1 and $2 million to still get by. So you really, in the end, you actually don't have enough money to make your cash flow.
Exactly, and that's the amazing part. That's that snapshot piece, is that you don't hear people often acknowledge that, but it is the reality of schools. So again, on the overall, we're seeing referenda more successful. We're also seeing referenda in rural areas wildly more successful because of some of the demographic stuff we talked about at the beginning of this. Those people value their schools. They're seeing people leave their communities, and that's the last gate that they're defending. So a couple of unique programs that run in Wisconsin that we actually kind of touched on a little bit earlier here, which are students that public schools are required to educate and take that little bit of extra push to help cover the costs of. Students with disabilities and English language learners. So over time, despite this trend here and how much we're paying for them, we've actually seen less students being identified with disabilities in the past few years due to a number of policy changes, but the overall cost to cover them has decreased still. So inflationary costs, being able to keep up, generally speaking, with continued costs of very high need special students have put a burden on the system, which has gone from 36%, as you see here, proration in 2001, meaning if you spent $1, you got 36 cents back from the state, to 26% now. Now, what is not shown on the slide for these people is that back in 1979, that figure was around like 78, 79% of the costs of students with disabilities. What that means in a practical purpose for classrooms is that those students are required to be educated. So if you're reimbursing at 26% of the cost that you've spent to educate them, you're having to make cuts elsewhere. Same holds true for English language learners. English language learners are a unique population that struggle to keep up with their peers because they don't use the language that's generally spoken in the classroom. Costs have been frozen over time. We have a vastly increasing population of these students in the state, which has caused the proration to go down. Another interesting piece about this particular slide is that when the Supreme Court last looked at the school funding system in the state of Wisconsin, it emphasized a few special categories of students and said, as long as you're meeting the needs of these kids and the state is generally meeting their constitutional obligation to fund and keep equal to school districts, we're okay with how things are going. The decision was called Vincent v. Voigt. Two of the three groups, that they highlighted specifically, students with disabilities, English language learners. So the question for everybody in the room here is, when does the state hit its tipping point where what we're doing to fund our schools is not constitutionally meeting the obligations of the state? Talk a little bit in generalities about what's proposed in the budget right now as it stands. So this is a look at the per student expenditures thanks to WisTax on average for the state of Wisconsin. So you see in reflection there the 5.5% reduction during the Great Recession that we talked about earlier, some of the increasing with the $150 per pupil that I explained to you. The per pupil would be gone in the first year of this budget, so that is a real loss of $150 per student that districts were spending last year. It'd be reinstated with a $165 increase. You'll notice the blue bar, though, is relatively flat. It is flat. There would be no per student increase on the revenue side. There is some backfilling of the both general school aids and levy credit that you will hear a lot of people talk about as support of public education. That doesn't mean that your local school districts are actually being able to spend any more money. It means that your property taxes are going to go down. Big red box, if you give more to that particular state equalization aid fund while you hold the first part of the equation on the left steady, it means your property tax portion on the far right goes down. This is another reflection of that same particular piece, just kind of broken out, also highlighting a couple of the other things that I thought I did. Highlighting some of the aid, the per pupil aid, how much it's going to cost and what it means per student. There we go. This is what I was looking for. School levy tax credit increased in both years. That's a tax credit that's specifically dumped in based on your property value in a district. It is not progressive in even the remotest sense. If you have the $1 million property in the particular district you're in, you're going to get more than the guy that owns a $100,000 house in the school levy tax credit. It's a flat tax credit. So it's another reflection of that particular piece here. Just kind of talks a little bit about how it's distributed. It's also distributed to municipalities and not actual school districts. So it's an offset of cost. It's not an actual classroom piece. We do count it for aid purposes though, so you will again hear this particular fund included as a support for public schools. So some of the bigger policy changes and cuts that you probably have heard about. We do have a little bit of funding and help for rural schools in this budget. It's very small. Most of them, I think, will tell you that $150 cut that they're seeing in the 2016 year is going to eat all of that cost plus some. We do have some different voucher and charter expansion, which we can get into if you want to. I don't know how deep in the weeds of you are of that. Statewide Charter Authorizing Board, which can authorize charters that are paid for off the top of general school aid funds anywhere in the state. We have some changes at the policy level for actual schools and districts regarding the standardized summative assessment at the end of the school year, how we rank and rate school districts, the report card system. One of the things I would point out to you that is particularly odd and egregious though is the alternative licensure type for public schools. So the budget has a piece in it that describes a licensure in which you could apply for and take a test that is completely outside of the scope of pedagogy or any kind of classroom experience and allow you to be licensed to teach in the state of Wisconsin. Kind of contributing to that have and have not situation that we talked about earlier too with school districts. A couple of other major cuts to highlight. I'm sure you guys have all heard about the cuts to the UW system, but also the Education Communications Board, which is a wonderful service that gets provided to school districts and students around the state that allows them to tap into digital resources. If you ever heard of the Digital Media Lab, they produce educational videos for classrooms that people air.